Warning. The following content may contain elements that are not suitable for some audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
You know, that warning is getting old. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, or whatever you are here today watching the show. Thank you, and welcome to the 14th edition. Wow, that's a lot of shows. 14th edition of Whispered Insights, the show where you get smarter just by listening to me talk to smart people, or something like that. We're working on the tagline. Anyways, my name is Esteban Kolsky. I'm the host. I have a fantastic show today. I have some fantastic shows coming up. Before we get started, let me give you a little bit of some housekeeping or whatever I say. Next week on the 24th, we are actually talking to a fantastic guest. It's the first, actually not the first. It's one of the people that I've been trying to get from the very beginning. His name is Doug Searles. He was one of the co-authors of the Clue Train Manifesto back in the day, and he's been doing an immense amount of research in things like privacy, in things like AI, in things like how you actually make decision making, how do you actually look at the whole story versus piece of the story. We had fantastic conversations in the past, and I want to bring him because A, he's smarter than I am, and B, because that way we can talk to somebody smarter. So that's the next one coming up on the 31st, which is Halloween. We have an even better show. No, not better, an exceptional show as well. Sorry. And that's going to be with Alan Bergson, who is one of my co-hosts that he's been here before, and Jeff Gomez. And we're going to talk about corporate narratives. And then we're working in November right now, but you'll get the rest of the shows soon enough. And now that I've vabbed for a while and you added enough time for my guest to get here, I guess, Jody, we can bring him in. My guest today, Jonathan Reed. The topic, adding independent voices to your decision-making. The man, the myth, the legend, Jon Reed.
Hey, can you hear me? I had some audio misadventures today. How's my
sorry,
audio?
No, I'm kidding.
Is the audio okay?
Yeah, you're fine.
Cool.
You're fine.
All right, good. Yeah. My mixer decided to break right before the last show I was on. I was just on a very fierce generative AI discussion, so I'm all hot and bothered, man.
That's good. I like the hot and bothered. This leads to better conversations here.
But actually, that'll be good because I think eventually we can tie generative AI down the road in a future episode into some of the themes you and I have been discussing.
I'll be happy to talk about any shiny bits that you want to talk about.
This topic to me is vitally important because it gets at the heart of why you're doing this show in the first place, in my opinion. Because if independent voices don't matter to the enterprise, then you and I should just go home.
Yes, I agree with you. And here's the thing. One of the reasons why I know we were chatting on this, trying to come with a topic for the show. And in case you never heard the show before, I don't prep for the show in the sense that I don't distribute questions, and we just come up with a topic and then we talk about it. There's nothing that is prepared. There's nothing that is being done other than just getting smart people to talk about interesting topics. And we were actually going back and forth, and you had written an exceptional article on LLMs. And I said, hey, maybe we can actually talk a little bit about the role that LLMs play in decision making. And you said, at the same time that I was texting, you were texting back, we should talk about adding independent voices to the decision making, which made my LLM suggestion so utterly stupid that we're not even going to try it for now. Maybe later in life, but for now, because this is a critical topic, and you're the perfect person to talk about this because you and I have similar path in the sense that everything we've been trying to do for the last 20 plus years that I've known you, that you have been trying to do, that Dennis Howlett tried to do, that I tried to do, is keep independent voices independent, stay away from all the fucking bullshit that basically research houses are throwing out there, and try to come up with information that actually makes sense. And that's actually what I wanted to talk to you about this topic. So,
yep,
that's a long way to say, why do independent voices matter, John? Question mark.
Yeah, and at some point I'll paste into the chat, but I've written about 15 articles on Diginomica on the topic of independence in enterprise projects, because there's actually a number of different angles to this. So I'll pop that into the chat at some point. But one of the things that has been most encouraging to me over the years is seeing that the projects that I consider to be the most successful, where I'll do an interview and and I'm like blown away by the team and the culture and what they're doing, is they seem to have one thing in common, which is a lot of the key team members or players, they come up for air more often. They're more connected to the outside world. They're not just living insular lives inside of their companies, and they want to ask tough questions. I just got back from a show, actually it was a Workday show, and I was talking to a CIO there, and we had this fascinating debate on AI, because for him it's very practical. He has to make organizational decisions on what to deploy. And for us to have that kind of banter, like, I think both of us kind of found it invaluable, because I'm coming at it from a totally different angle. But, the thing about independence in this world is that they're not as tied to your commercial interests, so they're free to speak freely. And also, it's tough in this world as independents. You got to bust your butt. I can't think of too many independents in this world that in the enterprise that don't really know their stuff, because if you don't, you're going to get washed out of this game a long time ago, or take a high paying job at a vendor and relax for a little while. Sorry, Esteban, I'm not talking about you. I'm
telling you, it's been my struggle from the beginning. I work for Gartner. I was a Gartner. I know Brent's not here, but he can take a shot if you want. But when I work at Gartner, one of the reasons I left Gartner is because Gartner began to lose its independence. Once Gartner made the shift from serving practitioner audiences to actually serving vendors, because there was better money and easier way to grow revenues, then Gartner transformed itself into a different place than the one that I wanted to work at. And that's one of the reasons I left. There were many other reasons, but losing the independence to me is one of the things that would have, like you said earlier, it would basically terminate my career. If I cannot be independent, I cannot express my voice without fear of retribution from a commercial entity or from a customer or whatever, then there's no point in doing what we do, right? That's the bottom line, and that's the reason why you started the Genomica with Dennis Howlett back in the day.
Indeed, and we can talk a little bit about the fact that a lot of the tech trends and the haven't really favored independent voices, and
right.
and that's made this more difficult. But also we need to problematize the meaning of independence a little bit, because no one in this field is truly independent, and I can get to that in a minute. But I do want to carry over briefly from our last conversation, which was marred by a few technical difficulties, but we discussed the problem of fake news in the enterprise and the importance of constructing kind of a BS filter, if you will. And that topic carries over a little bit, because if you're a decision maker in the enterprise, there's a couple things that you need and that have kind of proven successful. One is you're building a network of trust around you that helps you to make better decisions and do your job better. And that network is probably a diverse group of voices inside and outside your company that you turn to. But even if you have that, you still need to, what I call design for discovery, which is make sure that you're not lost in a filter bubble where you're just trusting social algorithms to serve up information. You need to seek it out. But as far as the independent voices are concerned, some of them just become an informal part of your lives, like the way I was talking about that CIO, where we'll have a chat on LinkedIn, or I might see him at a conference or whatever. But then there's a much more structured role for independence on enterprise projects, which we can talk about today. One of the main reasons I talk about projects versus overall transformation is that while overall transformation can be a very worthy goal, I kind of prefer to focus on a project by project basis, because the way you get to successful transformations is by notching successful projects together. And so I tend to break it down into components. And within the context of an enterprise project, there's a number of very important roles that so-called independent advisors and experts of various stripes can play. And unfortunately, to this day, a lot of customers don't take full advantage of that. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But I see a lot of projects where there's way too much dependence, to your point. And we're not necessarily going to pick on a Gartner or a Forrester or a Accenture or a Deloitte. We can throw these names out there. But just trusting big brands with all of your decisions and offloading your trust onto those brands is a losing formula.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack on that absolute wonderful statement. So let me start a little bit. Start peeling some of the onion layers on this, right? What's an independent voice? It's a serious question, because we all have different definitions, right? But what's an independent voice? Not who, but what? How do you define?
Yeah.
How do you define as a CIO, CXO? How do you define an independent voice?
Well, I mean, in the context, I think it's helpful to think of this in a project sort of basis because there's something very subjective about saying you're independent, right? And you and I have all heard from people who claim they're independent, and we look at them and we're like, "You're not that independent. Come on."
Right.
In our industry, I personally think that a big part of independence is disclosure because we're all getting paid by someone. And so part of helping people understand where you're coming from is to disclose who's paying you. In our case, in Diginomica, we disclose our clients in every blog that we put out. There are only a couple of firms in the entire industry that does that, which is kind of weird when you consider that technically you're legally supposed to do that, but that's a whole different conversation. That doesn't get enforced in our industry. But so part of it is disclosure, but part of it is understanding that in a project context, an independent voice would be someone who doesn't have an ongoing financial stake in the project in the same way. So for example, you might bring in an independent firm to do vendor selection, knowing that they're going to walk away from the project after that phase is over. Or you might have an independent advisor who's going to meet every 6 months for a status report. And while they do have an ongoing vested financial interest in your project in that case, it's a radically different percentage of the budget than your so-called prime vendor. And so from a project perspective, the independent is someone who is essentially free to speak their mind to you because they don't have a ongoing financial stake.
Okay, so and I agree with that. So let's take the second example you said, right, which is a little easier to understand. You bring an independent advisor that shows up every 6 months. I mean, in the spirit of full disclosure, no pun intended. I mean, this is the business I'm trying to build right now. So this is what I'm having these conversations left and right with executives all over the place. You need to have somebody like this. I write about it. I've been writing about it for the last 6-8 months, whatever. So basically. How I mean, you are bringing somebody who will actually give you an outside voice that is void of influence from the vendor, right? But how do you ensure that person is void of influence? How do you ensure that the vendor is not paying them in the back end, or there's like no, if it's not a tit for tat or an exchange, isn't there something that ensures that person is independent? How do you find those people? How do you find true independence?
Right. Well, first, Jesus has a great comment, not just because he agreed with me. He says, trust is very key. CXOs need to listen and have unique voices. I see this all the time. As an independent consultant, I am for the customer, not the vendor. So the thing about it, Esteban, is that even if you're independent, it's not like you're coming from a different planet. Like you have customer references like everyone else. People can check out your activity on LinkedIn. I recommend, in the case of independents, reading their content, reading their blogs, watching them on video shows. A lot of it comes down to some level of connection and trust with that person's perspective. And can you necessarily validate everyone? No, but that the same is true of a prime vendor as well. So you could have a prime vendor that's a household name. You say, oh, I can trust them. But actually, Esteban, it depends a lot on the exact people that are on your project. And a lot of times bigger vendors may do a bait and switch, and the person you think you're going to work with gets reassigned to another project and you end up with someone else entirely. So trust is a very, very fickle thing. But in general, you're looking for someone who has a deep subject matter expertise that's directly relevant to the phase of the project that you're in at that time.
So trust is a personal thing. It's not a company thing. It's not a vendor thing. It's not a consultant thing. I mean, trust is you trust the person that has the independent voice, not the company that they work for, or not the situation that they're in, right?
I mean, look, we can beat ourselves up saying who's more independent than someone else, and I think that's a little bit unfair.
No.
That's stupid. Do you know what I mean? Like when you talk about, oh, I really want someone independent. Like, so for example, like I know some people who work for pretty large firms that you and I both know who still have managed to have strong voices in the market. And
Absolutely.
it makes you wonder why there aren't more people like that are pushing the envelope within larger companies. I mean, one example I can give is Meg Bearer.
Yep.
She when she was running success factors at SAP, she was very strong and vocal on social channels. So you can have that sense of independence even working for a large company. But in this context, what I'm specifically talking about is engaging independents in a formal contractual manner that don't have the same stake in your project as your prime vendor. It's not that easy to figure out who has a vested interest in your project because those are the vendors you typically rely on. And unfortunately, the way the enterprise works, customers tend to rely on their prime vendors, and part of it is just that there's still so much friction with the vendor approval process that it's just easier to go with the easy choice and say, I trust this vendor, I trust this software vendor, I trust this consultancy, so I'll just stick with them. But the problem is that creates a lack of accountability for those firms.
So how about the vendors that are starting to talk about trust as a currency, trust as a message, as a corporate narrative? That they're saying, trust is everything that we do is about trust. You have to trust us. You can trust us. I mean, can a vendor be trusted? Not the person working for the vendor. Can a vendor be trusted to have the customer's best interest at heart?
Well, I would argue that in a high stakes enterprise project where our careers are riding on success and failure, that you shouldn't trust anybody completely. And the whole I don't care how many projects you deliver with a particular vendor. I'm not saying that trust talk is totally irrelevant, but I get pretty impatient with it because to me, trust is about results in the enterprise context, not about saying platitudes and bullshit on websites and happy slogans. But the whole point is that the way you ensure the success of enterprise projects is not to put too much stock in trust, but to create systems of accountability where you have checks and balances amongst the service providers you're working with, so that they're holding each other accountable through the course of the project, and that way you're not putting too much blind faith in what you might call trust.
I like that stuff. I mean, so you basically shifting the onus of trust or the understanding independence from the executive to the vendor community that is helping you. I mean, a project is a vendor, it's a community of vendors. So it's not one single vendor that will deliver one project. You're going to have many different people, consultants, implementation partners, vendors, different smaller vendors for point solutions and things like that. So once you build a community, you actually enable that community to do checks and balances on each other, and that becomes a trusted element, an element of trust, more than you trusting each individually or not. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
I like that concept. Yeah,
exactly. So everyone becomes part of the same system of accountability. So no one is above being accountable in that context. Alan's got a really important question, and I agree with Jesus. So bringing in an independent voice has been difficult. What advice do you have? Now, so there's a couple things here. First of all, there's no way to sugarcoat the fact that bringing in independent advisors of various kinds, and we should probably get into a little bit more the types of independence that can help on a project, but there's no question that can create more political challenges on a certain level because you have more voices in the room. And then, of course, as I said, there's this friction around approvals. Typically, if you bring in a new independent, you have to get them onboarded and approved and all that kind of stuff. And so there's friction around it. But we're getting back to an inescapable reality, which is that if customers want to have successful enterprise projects, they have to take ownership of those projects from the beginning. And one of the traps of the customer success era is allowing vendors and software vendors and service providers to define customer success on behalf of the customer and measure it. Only the customer.
Oh, that's stupid. No.
But that's what happens all the time.
Customers. But
customers.
Hold on.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No,
go ahead.
First.
You triggered me on that one because I mean, here's the thing. I mean, you cannot let anybody but yourself define what you're going after and how do you define success. I mean,
yes,
that is just fucking ridiculous.
Exactly, but it's rampant in our industry. It's rare for a customer. No. It's rare for a customer to take full ownership of that. So the first thing is the customer has to take ownership for defining the metrics that are going to be used to measure the success of the project. So
yes.
So the software vendor can have all kinds of input. The service provider, if there is one, can have all kinds of input. That's the prime vendor. Typically, there's usually one major. There might be more than one, but there's usually one that's considered the prime. Everyone needs to essentially gather in the same room and agree upon the metrics by which the success of this is going to be measured, and hopefully on a very regular basis. Now, at that point, before deals are signed, to get back to Alan's point, before deals are done and contracts are signed with the big vendors, that's when the customer also says, and by the way, I'm going to have a series of independents involved in this project that's going to help create systems of accountability to keep us on track based on the metrics we're agreeing upon now. And the reason you have to do that then, Alan, is because it's like anything else. Before the contract is signed is when you have the leverage. And that's when you have the uncomfortable conversations. And the reality is that successful projects don't happen without uncomfortable conversations. So you have to start those early. So that's the key. You can't come in later after you do all that and be like, it's going to be a lot harder later to be like, oh, I want to bring in this independent voice. That has to be all agreed upon from the beginning so people know what they're getting into. And ultimately, of course, they will, meet that person. Everyone will say, okay, we get along. We're on the same page. We're fighting for the same thing.
So we find people with trust. We find metrics that we want to, make to be used to be success, to define success. We get everybody aligned in these metrics and how to get there. We get independent voices like, the quote unquote auditors, essentially. I mean, like Alan is saying, create systems of accountability up front, but you get auditors that actually not only advise before the project starts, but also as the project goes on, as well as after the project is done, from their independent stance. What is it that, they see that could be improved, could be done better, could be done worse, pick whatever, however your metric of success is, right? This is what we're talking about. But to me, the hardest part in this journey so far is finding those independent voices. And I hate to go back to this because, we can say independent voices. Look, we have Alan, we have Jesus, we have you, we have me, we have Brian Sommer, we have, a limited number of people that have made their career. Dennis Hallett, before he retired, was one of them. Even VJ at IBM right now. I can never say his last name. I'm horrible at names.
VJ Sanker, yeah.
Sanker, yeah. So even he remains.
He's a great example of someone who works for a large company, but has maintained a very strong independent voice.
Even when he would work for SAP, he was still an independent voice, right? Those are the people that actually retain an independent voice and challenge the status quo. But that's a handful of people. You press me and I'll find 20, right?
Well, yes and no, but your definition of that is a little narrow for my case. So let me. Okay. So what we have to do now is talk a little bit about the different roles that various kinds of independents can play. So for example, like someone like VJ, he might play a very informal role because VJ has a very focused role at IBM. He runs their financial services division, and so if someone wanted advice from VJ and they were running a project and it wasn't financial services and IBM wasn't a service provider, but they just wanted input on what he's seen with like AI projects in action, for example, give me some gotchas. We're considering AI. That would be like an informal conversation that you would have. That's all part of having an informal network of trust around you that's invaluable to you. You probably helped VJ out in the past. He helps you out. You have a nice conversation with him, maybe at a conference or at a bar. That's free. That's open discussion. That's before the project started. That's the earliest phase of independent involvement. Then there's a slightly more formal phase, which is let's say I'm looking at overhauling how I approach customer experience and think about CX. I have some old CRM systems and I have e-commerce, but the dots just aren't connecting. I don't think I'm really thinking about this the right way. You're the kind of person I'd want to talk about at that point. I haven't made a lot of software decisions yet, but I feel like my processes are stale. My systems are a bit clunky. I have some new technology, but it doesn't connect very well. And I just don't have a good vision of everything. You're the kind of person I might really want to talk to about that. And this would be before I selected any vendors. I would just really want to talk broader about my goals as a company at that point. That would actually be a commercial engagement. That might start with an informal bar conversation, but you're an expert in this area. I want input from you. That's a formal contractual relationship. So that's the first type of independent, and that's the kind that you've mostly been describing. But then there's the next phase, which is, okay, man, Esteban really fired me up. I got some really great ideas, and I might involve him in the project in the future in some way. But now I kind of have a sense of where I'm going with this overall transformation. I've disseminated that with my team. Now I'm getting into software selection because I want to, let's say I want to get a customer data platform, whatever the fuck. So at that point, there's a whole collection of independents that specialize in software selection, and many of them you may not even know about. For example, there's a firm in Boston called Upper Edge that does this. You can engage them around helping you around software selection. You can talk about the pros and cons of different vendors, and essentially your goal is to come up with a short list that you want to further evaluate. There's very specific firms that do this software selection phase. It might be different. Now that might be you, but it might not be you. And
won't be me.
And so the point is that there's different independents that specialize in different phases of this. And so what you're describing is a more limited umbrella that can do certain things, but they can't do everything. And there's other forms of independence, but I'm not going to do a whole monologue on every different kind.
No, you're
I'm going to put
fine.
the brake on that.
Look, this is about smart people, vis-a-vis you, having a conversation about the topic. So we're doing it right. And I was just going to get to Alan's question. I mean, like, if independent voices that you bring before are not sufficient, is there a value to vendors to groom? And John Tashek has done an incredible job within Salesforce of adding, independent evangelists essentially to his team.
Yep.
Team was decimated recently, but there's still good voices remain within that team. Right, and I've seen that also happening in other places that the vendors have been adding, like the show you were just doing with Michael Wu, who works for Pros as a chief AI scientist. Right, I mean, the guy is an incredible evangelist for AI and has incredible insights, very independent, very very interesting to talk to and everything. So what is the value to a vendor in fostering this independent voice among the employees? But more important, this is the part that kills me. How does a vendor go about fostering, enabling, empowering these independent voices? That's the two questions that I think that we need to go to broaden the people available.
Yep. So Alan, you raised a really good question, and I have a bias around that. There's a strong value in this, but I'm going to concede to you that this does vary a little bit based on things like industry, regulatory issues, and company culture. So I'm not going to sit here and say that every company should be run like Jon Reed would run a company. So for example, in aerospace and defense, it's kind of understandable that they don't want a bunch of people goofing around on social media talking about missile defense systems and stuff like that. I totally get that. But in general, just if you accept my bias around this, there's two big components of value. One is the recruiting and talent attraction value. It's very attractive, I think, to most people when they see that a vendor has a culture where people can be open on social channels and openly discuss issues. I think that creates a very, very attractive working environment for other talented individuals to join. The other value is that unfortunately, when you work for a company, you develop an inherent form of tunnel vision. And even if you try not to drink the Kool-Aid, you ultimately drink some of your Kool-Aid. You can't. You have to drink it. And when you do, it creates blind spots. And the blind spots have to be challenged. And I see this again and again, Esteban, I know you have over the years in various kinds of analyst gatherings, where vendors would be like, why didn't I think of that before? And it's like, well, because you didn't meet with us in a year. That was too long. Like we should have had this conversation a lot sooner before you got so far down this idiotic path. The value, the value of having employees who are empowered to be more outspoken is it's one more channel to surface information to help vendors make course corrections sooner. So many vendors seem to want to be in a fantasy where they can just kind of float for a while and not deal with tough news. But in fact, the hard news is how you benchmark and say, you know what, we're not very good right now in this area, but we're going to benchmark it with your feedback, and now we're going to get better. That's how you should function as a culture, and that also includes not just independent voices among employees, but proper use of unvarnished customer feedback. Not bullshit feedback from your best customers that take all your products no matter what, because they're your best customers, but the hard feedback from customers that aren't happy. Well, the same is true of independent voices. That all fosters into that same culture of, you know what, we want to hear about the challenges and issues we're facing early early and often, and not be under this collective delusion that because we're a great brand, we're doing everything right. So that would be my argument for why that's valuable.
But you bring up an interesting point now. Something that I don't know if I've considered before. I mean, would you make your customers, prospects, and customers part of your independent voices that you listen to? I mean,
yeah, 100%, and good.
Formally, not informally. I know that it's done informally, right? But formally, truly as a vendor, say, I'm going to listen to you about the things that I don't want to listen to you about. I want you to tell me not what I'm doing wrong, but how I'm missing in what I'm delivering to you, so that I can actually do a better job. Would that be the question to ask?
Yeah, and by the way, Thomas's point around the ability to tap into something additional that is not on their radar, avoiding issues that haven't even been seen yet. Yes, of course, that's exactly it from the employee standpoint. But to your point, Esteban, smart companies have customer advisory boards that give them give them that dialogue and input. But there are some serious problems with that, which is that unfortunately sometimes it becomes too self-selecting. And again, you end up hearing what you want to hear from customers who are on a happier playing field than your typical customer. So obviously, sometimes there are commercial conflicts between actually paying a customer to provide independent services, but it depends on the customer as to whether that's a conflict or not. But the gist of it is, yes, absolutely. I mean, when I talk about decision makers needing to have diverse networks that they trust, that absolutely includes voices from their customers in both informal and formal capacities, as well as analysts, as well as media types, as well as services partners and what did Dennis Howell used to say, various waifs and strays. I mean, you need a full on network of people with diverse voices to help you make sense of this world right now.
So I mean, and I agree with you there. I think that one of the biggest problems with customer advisory boards is that the structure, for lack of a better term, circle jerks. Everybody's happy being talking to each other about what makes them happy, right? But nobody's actually broaching the tough topics to discuss. But so far, I mean, we're halfway in, and so far we said you need to find independent voices. They can come from anywhere. They can be within the vendors. They can be within your service providers. We'll get to that in a second, Alan. They come within, the service providers, vendors, people that in the industry, practitioners, analysts. I mean, I wrote a whole list of these people. You mentioned academia. You mentioned the press. So there's going to be independent voices everywhere that you do, right? I mean, we talked a little bit about how to find them, and we need to go a little deeper into that because I still don't think that there's enough understanding of how do you find these independent voices.
For sure.
And then the last part I would like to actually get to the question that Hans was asking is how do we make this come forward? Because I'm getting older, dude. I want out. I'm not going to be around forever being a grouch and a curmudgeon. I at some point I want to be able to say I've done my job. Now it's time for the next. But let's get to how do you actually find more of these voices and where do you find them? How do you track them?
So I think we're slightly ahead of that conversation, but we're almost there because what I wanted to sort of finish making clear was that different phases of the project require different kinds of independent voices.
Yes.
So I got us through software selection, but once you go through software selection, then you're in some type of implementation scenario of some kind. You're doing something. And there's a couple different things you can have there. One is you can have, in some cases, an independent project manager. A lot of times that doesn't work as well. A lot of times project management is a skill that's best cultivated internally. But it is possible to have an independent project manager. But a lot of times what is incredibly invaluable at that point is an independent, hands-on expert in a particular technology that really understands the ins and outs of that technology better than anyone else. And so, and a lot of times more and more that person's also specialized in a particular industry too. So, whether it's like Salesforce retail or SAP chemicals, there's someone who has worked on a ton of projects in that industry with that software. And that person knows things that other people just don't know, including a lot of times the prime vendor. And I've known a lot of these people over the years. I've done like video shows with them. I've interviewed some of these people. and some of them are incredibly sharp, like you. A lot of them started at bigger firms like a Gartner, but eventually, and then maybe they formed a smaller firm, and then maybe eventually they went out on their own. But the point is, like, they've seen it all, they've done it all,
Yeah.
like, and they have very specialized knowledge. So I think about like this one that comes to mind, Steve Bogner. He has a very small firm, but he's an HR payroll consultant in Success Factors. He knows everything. He knows everything about configuring these systems, dude. Like every minute point. A lot of times your prime vendor doesn't know that, and the difference is in knowing the proper way to configure something in your industry can be like enormous from a financial perspective. And so as you engage in a particular project, then you're also getting that type of expert to see that project through. And along the way, you still have your systems of accountability. And we could probably have a different show to talk more about that. But the point is,
we will.
The point is that you're still checking in periodically with other kinds of independents that are helping you to essentially audit your project, make sure it's on track. I mean, audit in less of a compliant way and more of us like, how are we doing kind of a way. But the point is that it's that strategic mix. And then to your point, you do have to be able to find these people, and finding them are based on exactly kind of the different kinds of roles that they might play. But in theory, like what you can do is tap into the network that you've built. And while I'm not exactly a LinkedIn fanboy, LinkedIn is a really fantastic place to start with stuff like this, I have to say, because you can do searches based on keywords, concepts, and you can tie them to your first degree connections. You can reach out to some people that you trust and start getting some referrals. You can combine that with things like good old fashioned Google search. The really well established people can still be found on Google a lot of times, so that in itself is harder to do than it used to be, which we can get to.
Yeah.
But the point is, once you know the role that you need and the role they're going to fulfill, like you can find people. But to your point, will it be super simple and easy? Not always, no. But they're out there. You just have to understand how they're going to fit into your project.
I need to challenge a little bit something you said, because I mean,
Okay.
I don't disagree with you in finding these independent voices and bringing them in, but I disagree that it's, for lack of a better way to say, it's smooth sailing. I mean, politics plays an incredible role. And your people will rebel against the independent expert that he brought from the outside and everything. And this is a been for me. I mean, and to your point, right? I mean, like there's actually, for some reason, there's more independent voices in HR than there in CX these days and CRM, but independent experts that you can bring in. But if you find these people and you bring them in, and your team rebels against it, or your team like doesn't really see the value, pick your play of words there, then politics get in the way, and then the expert doesn't have the value that it does. So I mean, I've seen this happen. I'm sure you have seen this happen. How do we overcome that? I mean, you can't mandate your team to trust somebody they don't know just because you trust them. So what do we do to overcome that?
Well, right. I mean, look, I mean, some organizations are pretty dysfunctional, and it can be difficult to make strides. I mean, part of what I'm talking about is if you have the right kind of organizational culture, people are used to listening to different points of view because you're fostering voices amongst your employees. You're elevating those voices. You're elevating customer voices. If you have a culture like that, then independent isn't as much of a shock to the system because people are used to hearing dissenting views and getting that kind of feedback. But if you're not cultivating that kind of culture, and suddenly you interject someone like you into that system, and it's a very closed culture, well, that's not a good recipe for success. So you have to attack this broader cultural problem of openness and transparency to some extent. If you throw an independent in that mix, it won't work. But I will say the onus is also on the independent to show the client that you can function amongst diverse constituencies. And so if I'm evaluating an independent, I will ask them, what kinds of political issues have you run into in the past with your clients?
Right.
And how have you handled those situations? Because the thing about independence is it's the good independents have to understand that it's their job to help make the project better, not to run the project. They're not always going to get the last word. Like, there has to be some facility on the part of that individual. But there are also ways of mitigating. So, for example, if you have a personality conflict between two people in particular, which can happen sometimes, then you have to create a different feedback structure, or maybe the independent has a different. But these are solvable problems. But to your point, the politics of it are real. But I guess what I would say is that if you kind of just say, well, we're not going to value independent voices because of the politics, I really don't like where you're going to end up as a company in the long run.
Okay, so one thing that he said, and I don't know if he said it directly this way, but that I agree with, is like, this is a cultural feature of successful companies, and this is an end-to-end. You can't bring an independent voice at the end, at the end of the project to say, okay, now that we've done everything the way we wanted to, here's an independent person who can tell you where we fucked up and where we did wrong, and then I gotta go back and fix it. You gotta do, like, look, this is the reason why when I work with clients, I work on retainer concepts. I mean, I work over 2 years plus, and then that's the way that it works. If it doesn't work that way, it doesn't work. You can't bring me in for 3 months to tell you what to do independent, and then you go and do whatever the fuck you want. That doesn't work, right? So that's the thing. But I agree with you 100% on that. And I think that if you actually have the culture, and if you have the people and you identify people and you bring it in, then, we go through all the stages. We go through, like, the business decision of actually going in this direction. We go through the process, the process of understanding the issues behind it. We go through the process of vendor selection, implementation itself, and then we get to success measurement. And then if you didn't do any independence before that, and you just bring somebody at the end to tell you that you've been successful and verified, and this is actually is what's become Gartner jobs for 80% of the time. People bring Gartner at the end of the process to like put a rubber stamp saying Gartner told me to do so, and therefore I'm not going to get fired, right?
Yeah.
This is when most of what I was doing. At the end, then it fails.
Right, and look, I mean, the reality, and I had a back and forth with Dennis Howlett on LinkedIn about some of these issues a while back, and one of the things I said to him is, like, I'm not about changing the entire enterprise. We're not going to change every corporate culture here. The goal is that there are some companies and some leaders that want to do things differently, and our job is to help those people have as much success as possible. You're not going to change every company. Some cultures are too broken, and it's not a fit. I mean, and Alan asks around, this is a good one that fits into our conversation right now, is there an on-ramp strategy for independence, break the ice projects? There absolutely is, and obviously, like, to your point around the 2-year retainer, yeah, that can work really well, but I probably wouldn't start someone on a 2-year retainer. I'd probably make everyone comfortable by starting with a much more discrete project and say, let's start with a 3 to 6 week engagement. Let's notch a win. And when everyone's feeling good about the relationship, then we can make a longer term commitment. So part of this around the politics of people is making sure that you have a little bit of an out for yourself, contractually, to make sure if it doesn't work out, we can both walk away. I think that's ultimately good for both parties. But yeah, I mean, look, I mean, not every company is going to quote unquote get it. And that's okay. What I find, like, the best thing about our industry is that there's always enough people thinking differently and trying things differently, it seems like, to find something interesting to do and some good people to work with. But are we going to like change everything and make everyone suddenly like radically open and transparent? No, of course we're not. We have to get off our high horse on that.
No, and I agree with that, and I wish it was like that because it'd be a lot easier. But unfortunately, the different layers that you described earlier, they're going in the direction of less independence, no more independence, and there's too much vested interest and too much at stake to move away from the lock-in model, right? And we tried to have this conversation last week, and it would have been perfect with Liz Miller, and then I had technical issues. I was in a place, by the way, as a side item, I was in a place where the main cable bringing internet to the small town was cut by a contractor doing work. And then I was forced to leave like it was 1995 with the 7,000 other people in the small town all going to the internet through our phones. And then Verizon and AT&T basically buckle at their knees trying to support 7,000 people going to the internet through their phones. So there was a whole day of no internet. And let me tell you, it wasn't as fun as you think it would be. And like everybody who says do a detox, don't do a detox. It's bad for your health. but we'll have that conversation back in again in November, December with Liz about that how does vendor locking play into this, right? Because I think the vendor locking is the biggest enemy of independence. To be honest.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
It is, and there's a lot of like ingrained cultural and structural reasons for that, and I think this thing around where the next generation of independent voices come from, that's a big concern for me. I mean, it's interesting because one of my hobbies, I have very weird hobbies. One of my hobbies is I run a group of 1,500 print-on-demand publishers, and it's rather shocking how the independent publishing industry has suffered so many blows in the last 20 years, to the point where there was one person in the group who used to encourage other people to get into the industry who said, I don't encourage it anymore. And I think like circumstances have changed on a number of different levels for independence. And we're not heading in a good direction either, because when you think about things like the impact of generative AI on search, it's all about presenting people with a bullet point list of easy to consume answers, and those answers are going to be the usual suspects. And the dream of the internet was always the long tail. It was always about niche experts connecting with niche communities.
Yes.
And the magic of that. And that long tail dream is in very, very serious jeopardy. And along with that, a lot of the things that you and I care about. But having said that, I mean, I think that was one of the reasons why I kind of formed an alliance with my other Diginomica co-founders, is I kind of sensed like it's going to get tough out there if I'm on my own with the principles that I have. And so I formed an alliance. And I think the future of a lot of this stuff is with these kinds of alliances where like-minded people band together and try to build business models together. Even if you and I don't have the same company, maybe we do projects together on certain kinds of ways and we try to amplify each other's voices. But yeah, I do think it is dangerous that independents are having a much harder time. And the fact of the matter is that younger people aren't drawn to this because the payoffs are nowhere near what they are if you go to a big vendor or even a big analyst firm and have that type of life. When vendors are willing to pay multiple six figures for evangelists, then people look at my life or your life and say, I don't want that. But it's funny because there are a handful of people that for you and me, I think, my freedom to speak my mind is worth more than any paycheck. So,
I will point to my history. We point to my history as a corollary to that comment of vendors paying for evangelists, high sums, and whether these evangelists tend to stay or not stay in those companies. It's just not, like you said, and this is the critical part. The people that will come into this next are the people who value the ability to say what they think and not be tied to a specific, statement or political forces that force them out of specific areas. This has, been my history, and it will continue to be my history. I cannot, in myself, and I'm going to do this as a editorial for 30 seconds if you indulge me, but I cannot be forced to be somebody other than who I am. And those are the people that we need to find to be the next voices. And I'm not entirely sure how we find those people. But one of the things that is happening that follow up to something you were saying is like, a lot of independent voices that used to be in research houses that were forced to go into, vendor promotion research, they're actually living and forming syndicates to create, to remain independent and deliver value to customers. Not everybody's going in that direction, but quite a few of them are people that I trust and I respect are joining syndicates. And these syndicates are becoming very, very, very interesting, right? And that's basically what I think there is like the next generation of independence. It's not the next generation. These are people like you and I that, experience matters for independence. And I think that the reason we are where we are is because of our experience. But these are people that are training the next generation of independent voices, I think.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And I think, if you kind of create a culture around that of like-minded people, that can be very, very rewarding. But it's just going to have to. There won't be as many because the vendor money is too good now. And let me be clear, I'm not insulting people who take that money because I understand why people. I understand why people want to provide for their families and have lives outside of work, and like the things that a lot of independents have to do to stay on the cutting edge is hard. And I get why people don't want those trade-offs. But one thing I did want to talk about briefly in this context, which fascinates me, is that Unfortunately, one thing I am a little bit concerned about is the smaller boutique analyst firm, because I was hoping that boutique analyst firms would be radical voices for change. But for the most part, I find that the boutiques are mostly just as big sellouts, if not more, than the big vendors like Gartner. Sorry to bash all the boutiques, but it's just the vendor money around, like, oh, I did a study that confirms that you're coincidentally you're the best vendor out there. Like, the money's too good. And you know, the thing that scares me a little bit is I do know a few boutique analyst firms that I really respect, but those are the ones that are actually having the hardest time financially. And you know why that is? You know why that is? Because they produce data that vendors don't like.
Yeah.
So and when you produce data that vendors don't like, the business model suddenly gets a lot harder. It's funny how that works.
But that's exactly what I said before. People need to provide for their families, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you leave a research house. I would think a research firm doesn't
Yeah.
come out of nowhere, right? Those people come out of the right research houses. Somebody needs to train you and get you into the right place. Need to get the right connections. Need to understand the markets, and then you go on your own, and then you do things on your own. And
Yeah,
then
and just to be clear, and just to be clear, there's a lot of great boutique analyst firms out there doing great stuff and providing value to customers. But all I'm saying is that it's not as radical of movement as I was hoping it would be 5 or 10 years ago. But I still think it can be more. But part of it is that vendors and customers have to get more comfortable with data that isn't comfortable data, that surfaces how they're not doing as well, and they have to get excited about getting better instead of just buying data that confirms how great they are. Because otherwise it's really tough, because if you're really committed to gathering objective data and people don't want your objective data, I think that's a very damning indictment in our industry, that type of firm would struggle. Anyway.
Yeah, but then so who do you blame for that? Do you blame the vendors that are doing what they can to promote the products, or do you blame the independents? No, wait a minute, let me give you another option to there. Or do you blame the independents that, like you said, and I totally agree, totally agree with the I mean, I'm going through that right now. Or do you blame the independents that, like, see how easy it is to go in that direction, and they just basically say, okay, I'm just going to go and, like, take a little bit, but continue to do my independent on the side. And disclaimers are very powerful on this. You could say, I have done a commercial project because this is what I do, right? This is what feeds my family.
Exactly. And you know what? I find those kinds of disclosures very welcome, and I actually find them disarming. And I really don't have a problem with people who are transparent about how they're getting paid. And I think we need a lot more of that in our industry, and I don't have a problem with it. And to your point, I have this very unconventional, I think it's unconventional view of our industry, which is I think we share collective responsibility and collective blame for the state of our industry. So one of my biggest concerns about elevating independence as a topic is to make independence seem like they're somehow more pure and have more integrity than everyone else. And I think that's a bad path to go down. I think we all have our hands full being more ethical and transparent. And our first job is to do that for ourselves and not. So even though I've been critical of other players, I'm just as critical of myself. So I just wanted to mention that.
No, look, I'll be the first one to tell you, your disclaimers at the Genomica were the basis for my disclaimers when I was an independent, analyst back, a few years ago.
You had the best disclaimers in the industry, man.
I copied them from you,
in your blogs.
I just took yours.
But you would, like, riff on them. You'd be like, I once met this person at this show, and it must be said that this person introduced me to this person, and this person paid me to do this. And I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, yeah, it's like basically like an audit of how you got paid, but in a very humorous way that I think is really appealing to people, because it's like, hey, I got to feed my family too. We all got to do it.
Yeah. And that's what I was going to. I mean, like, that's what I said when you said, yes, you blame the vendors. I mean, you can blame the vendors, you can blame the vendors, right? It's Arnold makes a good point. Make it easy to vet you as an independent expert, of course, full stop. Yeah, absolutely. But that's the thing. It's like, I'm not embarrassed to say I've taken commercial projects that I knew were not adding to my independent voice. They add to my knowledge and my experience, which eventually adds to my independent voice. But I knew they were just independent projects, and I'd be glad to call them out for what they are. And I would say, this person paid me to do this, and the findings are still validated by my expertise and my knowledge, but there's still findings that are limited to the project at hand. And that, I agree with you. That's a thing part. But we got about 3-4 minutes to go.
Can I talk quickly about Alan's
Sure.
vetting question? Make it easy to vet you. Just real quick on that. A few things,
Yes.
Alan. Independents should create IP, and you should be able to evaluate that IP, including things like video appearances, but also more substantive methodologies. The best independents have methodologies behind their work that they've shared and published, and then also independents should make it easy to test drive. So, I should be able to get on a call with you and give you something of value, regardless of whether you work with me or not. But this industry is full of relationships. So if I go on LinkedIn and I see an independent and they have no connections to anyone that I know, I'm sorry, but that's a flag for me. You have an uphill climb if you're not connected to a bunch of other people that I know and respect. That doesn't mean that I wouldn't ever work with you, but it's one more thing you have to overcome at that point.
Yeah, and that's the key here is like, excuse me, as you go forward, you need to make sure that the person that is independent is not independent because they say they're independent, no matter how easy vetable they are, no matter how they need to be like recognized in the industry. Otherwise, you're just aligning with somebody who decided to promote themselves, and there's plenty of charlatans, and we covered that really well with Liz Miller and with you, talking about BS in the decision-making process. So, but in the last couple of minutes, let's wrap this up as much as we can. I mean, we had a great conversation about the independence along the different parts of it. How do you become an expert? How do you identify an independent expert? How do you bring them in? How do you introduce them to your teams and be successful? How do you define your own metrics? Which I think is one of the most valuable things that you said. You define your own metrics of success and make sure that the independent person has to align to that as well as everybody else, and create a community of vendors, independent voices, your own teams that all align to the same metrics. That to me is the most valuable thing that you said today, even though you said many, many valuable things. But that's one thing that, how many people understand that? Seriously, serious question. Yeah. How many people understand that you define that an ROI in 6 months is not a metric of success? That a full integration and data migration in 3 weeks is not a metric of success. Those are table stakes. But what's your metric of success, right? So if I give you 2 minutes, which is about what we have, what's your wrap up of all this? I mean, how do we actually make independent voices part of with everything that you said? What's the thing that wraps it up, that summarizes whichever you want to do in 2 minutes?
Well, I think the biggest thing that I feel really strongly about, and I do have some data to support this, but some of it is a little subjective, is that the best enterprise professionals have the best networks really of people around them that challenge them and make them smarter. And that's true of projects too. Projects are kind of a living organism, and the more they come up for air and get gut checks, the better they're going to go, because none of us is perfect. And while I think trust and transparency are important topics, in a way, I think we need to create systems of accountability that give us fail safes when we do perhaps make commitments to things that are flawed or at least need review. And so there's so much opportunity here for us to have better results. And I think we all have an opportunity to do that. And these kinds of conversations are a really big part of that, because that's how we can start surfacing these topics. Because to your point, how often do we really talk about this stuff? Like, I would argue not nearly often enough. And so, today we've been able to do that and get a stake in the ground. And, maybe at some point later in the fall or early next year, you, me, and Liz can kind of try to pull the threads of your two dialogues around this together, because I think we have these interesting parallel tracks around this that could converge nicely at some point.
I think that you and Liz will do a fantastic show on your own doing that. I don't need to be there for that one. I'd be happy to, but I think you guys can have a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last part of this.
Oh, and by the way, big shout out to the people in the chat. That was huge. Thanks a lot.
I was just going to say that, dude.
Oh, sorry. Oh, you go.
Well, you took my thunder.
Oh, no, take it back. Take your thunder back, dude.
It's okay. John wants to thank everybody in the chat.
No. Sorry, dude.
No, that's okay. I was going to do that here, but the last thing is, like, what didn't we talk about? Really, really quick. We're going to talk about systems of accountability and this whole community of common interest in a future show. But what else didn't we talk about that we need to discuss? Or what's the question that we're missing here?
Well, I think some of the role of AI in all of this is important, and some of the ways in which independent voices can be enabled and supported through better technology on projects is really interesting too. So there's some different pieces of the puzzle we can connect. Thomas likes the double thunder, yeah. And it's interesting too, because when I look at the chat, I see people like Jesus and Ellen and Thomas, and I know a lot about what they've done in the market and that's one of the cool things if you're an independent is I know who I would connect to each of those people based on their interests. And so one of our big, to your point around finding the right person is, I think the best thing you can do as an independent is amplify your unique voice and expertise as much as possible and stick to your guns and just be outspoken and be expert and help people, and good things are going to happen.
Okay, sounds good. And again, to the people in the chat, Jesus, Thomas, Alan, thank you so much for being there and providing comments. I absolutely fucking hate 1 hour shows because they don't give enough time to have these discussions in earnest. And all I do is just monitor the time and move towards the end. This is a multi-hour conversation that you and I had. This is of this in many aspects before, and we'll continue to have. We'll have you back on the show. Cool. Jon, thank you so much for this. Thanks for anybody listening. And until the next one, where we're going to be with Doc Searles talking about when an idea is not a complete idea. It's a really interesting topic. See you next week.
By the way, Doc Searles, nice job, dude.
That's going to be dude. I'm trying my best.
That's going to be a classic.
I know. I love that guy. So thank you.